Welcome to PWS United, a podcast for the Prader-Willi syndrome community, brought to you by PWSA USA. This podcast gives the latest news in research, advocacy, and family support by bringing together staff, volunteers, PWS treatment specialists, biotech and pharmaceutical representatives, caregivers, family members, and individuals with PWS. Our goal is to share education, awareness, and resources with those living with PWS and their supporters. Join us in our mission to enhance the quality of life and empower those affected by Prader-Willi syndrome.
Today, we have an exciting episode with some truly remarkable guests and important updates to share about one of the most powerful tools we have in understanding Prader-Willi syndrome, the Global PWS Registry. Over the years, the registry has been absolutely pivotal in helping us learn more about PWS. It has guided research and played a crucial role in advancing the development of new drugs and therapies. The insights gathered from thousands of individuals and caregivers have shaped clinical trials, informed medical guidelines, and helped elevate the voice of the PWS community. And today, we're excited to announce that we are entering the next generation of the Global PWS Registry. The registry has moved to an updated, more intuitive platform, still hosted in partnership with NORD. This upgrade will make it easier than ever for caregivers to participate, update information, and continue contributing to the future PWS research. We're also incredibly excited to share news about the upcoming real-world study exploring the use of VYKAT XR for people with PWS. This study will capture day-to-day experiences and outcomes, giving us valuable insight into how VYKAT XR is used and how it truly impacts quality of life across our community. Joining us to dive into all of this are four phenomenal leaders in the field. Dr. Theresa Strong, Director of Research Programs for FPWR, Dr. Jessica Bohonowych, Associate Director of Research Programs for FPWR and one of the key developers in the Global PWS Registry, Lisa Matesevak, Study Coordinator and Administrator for the Global PWS Registry, and Lynn Garrick, Medical and Research Coordinator for PWSA USA. Welcome, ladies. Thanks for being here. So, Theresa, I'm going to start with you. Why is the registry important? And maybe for people who are unfamiliar with the registry, what exactly is it?
So the Global PWS Registry is a database of information about individuals with PWS. So it is generally completed by the parent of a person with PWS, and there's a series of surveys that cover everything from different medical systems like neurology and GI to living situations and aspects of behavior in PWS, which we know are so critical, and also things like what medications the person with PWS is taking. So we ask parents to develop a record for their child with PWS, complete the surveys as they can, and update them about once a year. And overall, the goal of the registry is just to better understand the spectrum of PWS. So we know PWS, or we hear everyone say, "Oh, PWS is a spectrum disorder," and that's true. But we need to have a good understanding of, what percent of individuals have scoliosis, what percent of individuals have surgery for strabismus, for example. And by asking these questions through the registry and getting a really big population of individuals with PWS to answer those questions, we can get a much better idea about all of the different symptoms of PWS and the complications that we see. And that helps guide us being not only the parents, but also the clinicians who use this data to develop guidelines on how to care for individuals with PWS.
Well, that's a lot.
Yes, it is.
Wow. One of my favorite things that I've seen come out of the registry is and Jess, you might be the person who's responsible for creating these, but the infographics. So for those of us who aren't in the medical field on this call, which is just me, those are really helpful from my perspective of seeing what is collected in the registry. Could you tell us how drug companies may have used the data from the registry when looking to create treatments or learn more about PWS?
I can start and maybe Jessica can jump in because she does a lot of the pulling the data that the drug companies request. But there's actually quite a few ways in which the registry has supported clinical trials. So, one way is by the development of different measures that are used in clinical trials. So many of the measures that are used in clinical trials, like the PWS Anxiousness and Distress Questionnaire, which measures, that anxious behavior that we see in PWS. It was developed with the help of the registry because it is a parent-reported measure. And so to get a baseline on, how so it was developed in collaboration with Levo Therapeutics, and then you need a baseline, like, what's the average score of individuals with PWS at different ages, and does it vary between males and females or the different genetic subtypes? So going through the registry and having hundreds of families contribute to the data there, so fill out the PWS, the PAD-Q for their child with PWS, allows then the drug company to see whether this is going to be a good measure in a clinical trial. So is there, an appropriate range of scores? Does it behave, pretty consistently across different groups? And, can it then be used in a clinical trial? So that's a major way that it's been used, not only for the PAD-Q, but also many of you are familiar with the food safe zone or the PWS profile that the team at Vanderbilt, led by Elizabeth Dykens and Elizabeth Roof, have developed. They also got the baseline data for those instruments through the PWS registry. So just expanding the measures that are used in clinical trials is one important way. And then another important way, which Jessica can maybe speak to a little bit more, is a lot of times companies will come to us and they'll say, well, we want to do this clinical trial in people with PWS age 16 and above, but they can't be taking an SSRI or, this medication or that medication. So what % of people are taking that medication? And Jessica, maybe you can talk to how you would answer that question
Sure.
and what other questions they.
Yeah, I would chime in another, and this speaks a little bit to what Teresa's talking about supporting recruitment for clinical trials as well. So another way that we use the registry a lot is sponsors will come and provide us with inclusion-exclusion criteria for their trial. And then we're able to go in kind of like a matchmaking service, like a dating service, and find out, okay, who are the people that match those criteria. And then through the registry, we are able to send the information about that trial directly to the families. And then it's the family's choice whether or not they would like to follow up with the contact information for the people who are running the trial. So everything, all of the contact information, health information is protected. We should probably highlight the fact that the registry is a study that is approved by an institutional review board, an IRB. So the registry has a protocol and a consent process similar to what you would do by going to a clinical trial, which the IRB is tasked with making sure that the data is being collected and managed and distributed in an ethical way that protects patient rights. So I did just want to highlight that because that's a question we get a lot about is who has access to the data? How is the data protected? Things along those lines. So sort of just jumping back, when like Theresa mentioned, if a sponsor is looking for information or wants to connect with patients, the registry serves as the mediator. But basically, like Theresa mentioned, we're able to dive into a lot of questions that sponsors may have that help them design their protocol in a way that makes the most sense for families. So it can be a sponsor trying to understand how many people live within a certain geographical distance of a trial site, or how many trial sites do we need to have covering what parts of the country in order to be able to make sure that, we're accessible to as many people as possible. Or like Theresa mentioned, how many people are on a certain medication, which ideally for the trial, maybe they would want patients who are not on that medication. But if we're able to tell them, look, the numbers, it's going to be really hard for you to recruit that trial, we can help solve that problem before it happens. We can help sort of identify some of those hurdles that can help families get into trials or participate in trials to help the process move more smoothly.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier was how this is being used. And I think for families who really want to participate in clinical trials and maybe their children don't meet the criteria for a number of reasons, but I think for age specifically, a lot of the trials you need to be a certain age to be able to
Yeah. Yeah.
here's a way for them to still contribute to research.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we can talk a little bit about how the registry data helped support some of the VYKAT journey through that trial process. We can talk about that a little bit. But absolutely, I mean, the thing that I always try to talk about when I'm giving a presentation about the registry is I kind of try to present it to families like, PWS is a big puzzle. And every single piece of that puzzle is contributing to the full picture of that puzzle. And so being able to provide your piece to that puzzle helps put the whole picture into focus. And sometimes we'll get questions from people, okay, well, my loved one doesn't really have orthopedic problems, so I don't need to worry. I don't need to do that survey. And my answer is always absolutely do that survey because we want to know, the community wants to know the full spectrum, people who are doing well for certain symptoms, people who are really severely suffering from certain symptoms, so that when, the goal is, you mentioned the infographics specifically, that's sort of how we started getting information out of the registry at the very, very beginning, is that when we see posts on Facebook or anecdotal stories from families, that we're able to go into the registry and actually put real numbers and real data, so that when somebody's asking, hey, I tried this thing and it worked for me, has it worked for anybody else? And there's families sort of communicating about that, about their personal experiences, we can take all of those experiences and actually put it into concrete data, concrete information.
I would add, Jessica, that, one of the things that's helpful is that once parents complete a survey, they can also see how their
Yes.
responses
Yes.
compare to everyone else who's already answered that survey. And it gives some really nice graphical representation of their experience relative to others.
Yeah, absolutely. So what Lisa's describing is for users in the registry, once a user has completed a survey, as long as there are more than 10 answers to that survey, which at this point there are hundreds of answers for all the surveys, then you as the caregiver are able to actually graph immediately the results to each individual question. So if you're really interested in, Teresa mentioned neurology, and maybe your loved one has seizures and you really want to know, okay, well, how does my experience compare to others? You complete that neurology survey, you complete all the seizure questions, and then you individually immediately get to see the answers, everybody else's aggregated graphed answers to those questions, which is a really, really cool part of the tool.
No, those answers are de-identified though, right? It's not
Yes, completely. Yep. It's this aggregate. It's like pie charts. Right? Yep. So it's like, here's of the 200 people who answered the question about seizures, 50 said epilepsy, 50% said epilepsy, 20% said febrile seizures. And it's just a pie chart or a bar chart, depending upon what makes the most sense for the data. It's just, it's a completely de-identified aggregate picture of everybody's answers.
as a data nerd, I wanna go in and do all the surveys myself so I can see them, but I don't have somebody to fill them out for.
Well, I think many of us on this call do have loved ones with PWS, and we can personally speak to how completely different all of our loved ones' experiences are. And it just, I think, is really highlights how individual everybody's experience with PWS can be.
I love that.
Jessica, maybe I can jump on something you said earlier, which is putting numbers behind the
Yeah.
story. And that also goes to the question that Stacy asked about, how else have we used the registry? We all know how important those individual stories are when you're talking to your representative and advocating for PWS, or talking to the FDA and speaking to the impact of PWS on your family. And those are critical stories, but I think the combination of those individual powerful stories and then the data of saying, well, we see hyperphagia in this percent of people, or we see this medical problem in X percent of people, and, just giving a numeric push behind those individual stories is just really helpful so that whoever's on the other end of those stories, the regulators, the representatives, they get a really complete picture of PWS.
Stacey, the registry was launched in 2015, so we're on our 10-year anniversary, which is amazing.
Congratulations.
Yep. And like I said, things started with the infographics, getting out to patients and to clinicians, and then that started garnering a lot more interest, and that led to several publications that have come out in the peer-reviewed literature, some of which have really led to some guidelines on how to improve clinical care, which I think is really, what Teresa's mentioning is really impactful for families. So Teresa, do you want to talk about some of those publications where we have found things that are actually like impacting clinical care?
Yeah, that I'll bring up one particular example, which is Dr. Sandy Roy at Cook's Children kind of came to us and said we're seeing this increased complications in babies who get a G tube, so right into the belly as opposed to an NG tube, which is where it goes down their nose. But they don't see that many children, infants with PWS per year, so they weren't sure if it was just a quirk in their data or was this kind of a country or worldwide problem. And so we worked with them. They developed a survey specifically about G-tube or whatever feeding tube use and complications from those feeding tubes. And we put that into the registry, and several hundred of you contributed to that data set. And with that, they were able to show, first of all, that I have a son with PWS who's, just a bit over 30. And back in the day, the moms in sort of our generation, they almost always used NG tubes, and the rate of complications was fairly low or very low. But more recently, people have turned to G tubes a lot. Clinicians oftentimes were putting in G tubes. And it did turn out that those infants who had G tubes had a 25-time higher rate of complications because it is a surgery to put those G tubes in, and then there can be complications afterwards. And since the NG tubes, kids who had the NG tubes did as well as babies who had the G tubes in the end. And so it has changed the practice at Cook's Children's where they recommend that an NG tube be used and not a G tube. There are certain cases in which a G tube does need to be used, and they still recommend it in those certain cases. But most babies with PWS do fine with an NG tube, and then it reduces the complication rate. So that study is now in the medical literature so that any physician anywhere can, if they're at a hospital that sees very few babies with PWS, they can go to the medical literature, they can see this paper, and they can choose an NG tube to try first and maybe avoid some complications. So it's been nice on very many levels as far as guiding care. Many of the people who contributed to that survey had older children and were providing their experience when their child was an infant. And I think it's a way to give back to the new parents that are coming along. So it also is that, kind of helping the entire community feeling.
I love that you used that example because out of that paper, we worked with Dr. Scheinman to create a consensus statement based on that information that we use when we're doing any sort of advocacy in the NICU.
Mm-hmm.
Is what we see a lot of times now is hospitals not wanting to discharge unless somebody's on a G tube. It won't discharge on an NG. So we're able to use that to advocate for those families. So I love that what came out of that is not just the research, but
Right.
real world examples of how it gets applied.
And that's the goal. I'll add too that all of the papers that come out of the registry, we really prioritize that they are published in what are called open access journals, meaning that you don't need them. In the scientific literature, there's some journals where you need a subscription or you have to pay to have access to the actual primary reference to the original article. But we really prioritize that any of the papers that are coming out of the registry are accessible to families. And so everything that comes out of the registry is open access, exactly what you're talking about, Stacy. So families can print it out and have it in their hand when they're with their physicians to help advocate for themselves. Some of the other topics that have come out in some recent papers, because we just talked about infants, but we're also trying to look at things that are impacting adolescents and adults. We know that there's difficulty in accessing growth hormone or people struggle, and we've been able to actually put some numbers to the ages that people are coming off of growth hormone and the reasons why. And that's, I think, going to be a priority area for families. We know mental health can be a major issue. And there was a paper that came out really highlighting how a lot of the mental health and behavior issues in PWS are associated with poor sleep. And so hopefully that can help families advocate when they're going to their physician for sleep tests and for CPAPs or other things that, they may need to help their loved one get some good quality sleep. So that's it's exciting to hear what you're saying about people using those resources.
And Jessica, I'll mention with the sleep, that was Jessica Dewis's work. And it was only because families completed the whole behavioral survey and also completed the sleep survey. And then you could look at like who has poor sleep and what are their behaviors like compared to parents who are reporting that their children and young adults with PWS get good sleep. So, it is important to fill out, as many surveys as you're able, because sometimes we see links that we wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I think that's an understandable link, but sometimes we see links that we wouldn't necessarily be able to see unless we have all of that information. And that's, for example, the medications, what medications is someone on and what GI problems do they have, for example. So, having a very complete registry allows us to pull out information that we might not otherwise understand.
Well, and back to Jessica, you made the point about somebody who wasn't going to fill out a particular survey because it didn't apply. The lack of symptoms is also data.
Absolutely.
So, one of the biggest projects that has been done through the registry is the Path for PWS. So, Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about what that was and, really everything about the study?
So the PATH study was a project that we launched in 2018 through the Global PWS Registry, and we had an overwhelming response to families interested in participating, which was really wonderful because I think it showed the power of our community. It showed that families were really wanting to give back, as we mentioned before. Like sharing your personal story can be very empowering. So we had over 650 families that were enrolled in the Path for PWS study, and this was ages 5 and older. We actually had about 40% of the participants in the study that were over the age of 18. So it gave us really good information on that adult experience with PWS, which may not have been fully characterized before doing the PATH study. And through that, we asked families to complete a number of surveys every 6 months, and we were looking at a lot of information. But notably, one of the surveys that was developed specifically for the PATH study was our serious medical events survey. So with that, we were really looking at collecting information on medications that people were taking, as well as medical events that were sending your loved ones for medical care, either in the hospital setting, emergency room, urgent care, and so forth. And, I think as parents, we all kind of talk to one another and we know what others' experiences are. We see it on social media, but this really gave concrete numbers to identify where our biggest challenges were. And some surprising things came out of that information. In fact, we looked at the top types of events that were sending people to the hospital. And maybe it's not a surprise to anyone that the mental health and behavior things were what were most commonly resulting in these medical needs being met in an urgent care hospital or ED. But now we have definitive information that says what percentage of our participants in this study, spanning that age range from 5 and up, that whole spectrum of PWS, how is this impacting our community? But collecting the information about the medications was also really informative too, because we could look at the ages at which we started to see trends upwards in medications being prescribed for these kinds of behavior and mental health issues. And what we saw was a significant incidence of polypharmacy, or otherwise known as people taking multiple medications for the same indication. So our loved ones may start with something like a stimulant in those younger years because they're exhibiting signs of things like ADHD or other things. But as they get older, you may see a trend towards medications that are prescribed for anxiety or other, mental health reasons. And what we see is this large number of individuals that are being prescribed multiple medications. And so we could look at changes in those medications over time. In fact, Dr. Singh is going to be looking at our data more closely and will be sharing that information back out to our community so that we can understand better what that medication profile looked like in our PWS population. The other thing that I thought was very notable was that we saw a large number of individuals having scoliosis surgery, but importantly, a large percentage of those individuals were having significant complications. And so I don't think I fully appreciated that experience. And in fact, being the study coordinator during this Path for PWS study at a time when my own son was having his spinal fusion, I felt empowered to go to my son's physician and say, these are the things that we're seeing documented. I have concerns. And let's talk about how we can avoid potentially having some of these pitfalls. And so I think one of the things that we absolutely want to do is share that information back to the community so parents who are facing that potential need for spinal fusion down the road can share that information with their surgeons, and orthopedic surgeons can look at that information, and maybe that will impact their clinical care plan for people with PWS. So there were a lot of really informative things that came out of the PATH study. We completed the final surveys for our study participants in January of 2024. However, that doesn't mean that people can't still fill out these surveys. They still live in the registry and can be completed every 6 months. The only survey that is unique to the PATH study is that serious medical events survey, and only those that were in the study have access to that. But that being said, I think we got a really clear understanding of what is challenging our families most often and what that picture looks like over the lifespan of people with PWS.
So you mentioned
Lots of papers coming out in the next year or
Yes,
so.
good. Many, many, many.
Lots of papers, and putting all of this documented data out into the community in the next year or two.
That's awesome. So if you've never filled out a survey and you're new to the registry, do you still have access to those paths or surveys, or do you have to have already filled them out to be able to keep filling them out every 6 months?
So all of the ones that were in the Path for PWS study are available to every participant in the registry, existing or new, with the exception of that serious medical events survey. That was unique to the PATH participants. The PATH participants can still see that survey, and they can still complete that survey if they choose to do so. But new participants entering the registry and existing participants who were not previously in the PATH study, that survey will not appear to them.
We're analyzing all that data, and I think as a result of there were more than 1,800 events that occurred in PATH participants over the PATH study. So I think that's going to inform our next round of new surveys, right? So as we pull things out, like I think, we had heard that there was potentially increased complications in individuals undergoing spinal fusion surgery, but now we really see it, and we can see exactly what happened in those cases, and that may inform a new survey down the line that asks more specific questions. So I think we're at that point of learning from the existing data and building new studies to take us to the next level of understanding on some of these things.
How often do new studies get added? I know, or new surveys. I know, like during COVID, we created the COVID survey and that went in there. But like, how frequently do you add new surveys?
It fluctuates. I feel like like you mentioned, one of the great things about the registry is that it is so dynamic. So we have the ability to add surveys, like you mentioned, when COVID hit. And that was another, sort of topic that was of really great interest. Some really interesting things came out of that. We were able to pretty quickly, within a month or two, develop a survey, get it out there, analyze some data to be able to assess. At that time, we were, the community is really concerned. Okay, are the shutdowns and lockdowns impacting access to healthcare? And we were able to quickly see that it was not impacting access to like medical primary health care, but it was impacting access to therapies. It was impacting access to like occupational therapy, physical therapy, things like that, speech and language therapy. We were able to provide some information about how people with PWS, how school-age children with PWS were responding to going to class at home, things along those lines. But one of the great things is that when something comes up, we are able to add a new survey. And I think as soon as I'm finished, this is a great opportunity to talk about the new survey that we're going to be adding. So some of it is when we as a community, the registry staff sees a need, like we did with COVID. Some of it is when there are researchers who are interested in conducting a study through the registry. So like Theresa mentioned, when Sandy Roy came to us and said, hey, I really want to do this analysis about feeding tubes. And, we worked with her to develop that. There's another project that's ongoing in the registry right now with a researcher he has expertise in some of the early indicators and early symptoms of obsessive compulsive behavior and anxiousness and anxiety in other populations. And so he is running his surveys through the registry as well to see how those assessments that he has used in other populations work in PWS. The goal there would be that if we can identify some of the early warning signs of somebody who's, starting to experience those behaviors, that we could intervene sooner to help alleviate the development and or severity of some of those, like I said, for example, obsessive compulsive behavior or psychosis, things like that. So some of it really depends upon what researchers are when they come to us. But we do have a new survey launching soon because we have a major thing in the community that we need to understand. So Theresa, do you want to talk, or who wants to talk about the
before we get to
VYKAT
that
survey?
one, can I ask how version 2.0 is going to affect all of the surveys?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, the registry is 10 years old. The registry is hosted on what is called the I Am Rare platform, which is hosted by the National Organization of Rare Disorders, NORD. For anybody who's not familiar, is it's an umbrella organization based in DC for all organizations of rare disorders. There's on the order of 10,000 different rare diseases that people don't know about. And so they provide a lot of resources and advocacy for the entire rare disease community. And we were one of the very, very first registries on their platform. They now have dozens on their platform. And they, in the past couple of years, have recognized the need to upgrade the platform to some better IT. I am not an IT person, but they have upgraded to a newer version of the platform that supports the registry. From the user side, it will be more mobile friendly, so it'll be easier to use on like an iPad or an iPhone, things along those lines. It just has a better look and feel. It's just a little bit easier to use. On the back end side, for those of us who are analyzing data, there are some capacities which make it a lot easier and faster for us to pull and analyze data. You'll still be able to see all your survey results, but one of the great things about it is that this is the first time that the registry is going to support multiple languages, which is key to it truly being a global registry. It's global in that anybody can participate, but to date, everything has only been available in English. And so the first two languages, everything will be translated into French and Spanish. So hopefully, that's going to help not just globally, but also hopefully within the United States, accessing some of the underrepresented communities who may not have participated so far within the United States alone. And then following that, it will be German, I believe, and Brazilian Portuguese are the next two. Basically, NORD identified, what are the languages that are most represented among their communities, and they're prioritizing in that order of languages. So the registry is currently we're finalizing the very, very last steps of moving to this new platform. So for those of you who are in the registry, there will be a period in probably early mid-December for about a week where the platform will be unavailable, and then we'll relaunch on the brand new platform. Anybody who is in the registry, all of your information is transferring over automatically. You don't need to do anything. It's all migrating over, and then you'll receive instructions on how to activate your account on the new platform. So if you are a current registry user, no fear, everything's being managed and migrated for you. And if you want to be a part of the registry, you can still go in and join now. And we made some changes, feeding into what Theresa mentioned, sort of some of our lessons learned. We've added some questions in certain surveys based upon, data that we've received so far over the past 10 years, maybe areas that people were writing in comments. And we realized, okay, this is happening enough in comments that we need to actually put some formalized questions to this. But the biggest part of the new launch is the new survey that is very important to the community. So I think
Lynn, you
Lynn's
want to tell us
yeah.
about it and why it's important?
Ta-da! This is what we've all been waiting for. So it'll be the new VYKAT module. This is so important for our community. We've been waiting for over 20 years for something other than growth hormone to come along. And this is the first FDA approved drug, right, for hyperphagia. So for the first time ever, yay, we'll be able to capture this information in real time about how VYKAT XR is working in the real world outside of that clinical trial kind of setting. So how is this affecting families, the individuals? How is it working? How is it not? So some of the questions that we're hoping that we're going to be asking will inform us about who might be most likely to benefit from VYKAT XR. How long is it taking to get the actual prescription once it's written into your hands? And what are some of the barriers to approval or payment from insurance companies or physicians? What side effects might be occurring? And are there risk factors that we can pull from this survey that might predict who might be at risk when they're taking VYKAT, and how then we can inform physicians to maybe change some protocols around that? And what sort of monitoring doctors are using, and how does this differ across different clinics? For example, how often are people checking blood sugars? Some physicians may check it every day and some people might go with something else. EKG monitoring, all of these things. What other things are doctors using, and what benefits are people seeing? How long does it take to see those benefits? We've seen a week or 2 to 6 months to 9 months. So what is the average time? And then importantly too, for those who choose to discontinue the medication, why are they discontinuing, and how has the individual's response been? How are those behaviors relating food or anxiety? How has that changed since discontinuing? So this really moves us into a new phase of the registry use, where we can look at real world time of effectiveness of a new drug. And so when we're looking at additional drugs, when they become available, it allows us to better understand how to optimize the use of these treatments. So it's just such a huge and important survey for all the families to be utilizing.
I have one comment and one question. So my first comment is, I love that we're going to be collecting this data in a secure place. So we know anecdotally people are putting things out in public places, and it's very difficult to collect, or impossible to collect that data and do anything with it when it's in those places, and it ends up being used in various ways. So I love that we're going to have a place that's confidential and that we're able to, do this. My question is, the other surveys are being completed on a 6-month basis. Will this also be 6 months, or will there be a shorter time based on potentially when side effects pop up or the effectiveness?
We're going to start with a 6-month. So, obviously there's that titration period.
Right.
And so it'll be a little bit of a look back over the titration period. But we didn't want to, it's always that balance of not wanting to be too much of a burden, but getting the information we need. So we thought within every 6 months, it should be fresh enough in your mind about what was that titration period about, what side effects popped up, and what was done about those side effects. We can change it. That's the great thing about this registry and the platform is Jessica's worked so well with the NORD team. If we feel like we're not getting the right data, we can change the intervals. But for now, I think we're going to start within every 6 months. The approval came in the spring. And so there are many people who have, gotten onto VYKAT over the last few months. So they can go in kind of on day 1, which will be in mid-December, as we've said, and talk about their experience to this point, and then again in 6 months. And I think looking at that, we ask questions about the effectiveness with hyperphagia, but also are you seeing any other behavioral benefits? So capturing those on a 6-month basis, I think will be hopefully very helpful. And again, we're encouraging people at the same time to do some of these other assessments, like the hyperphagia questionnaire. We have the hyperphagia questionnaire in there and some additional questions on hyperphagia and behaviors that we see when our kids are really hungry. Also collecting data on their anxiousness, on how you're locking up food. So if we see benefit that would lead to a kind of loosening of restrictions, it's very likely that will take many months to see that, because parents aren't going to I wouldn't think, just start unlocking things. But yeah, I hope not. That's probably not a great plan. But if they can, or what we know from the Path for PWS data, because we also looked at food safe zone every 6 months, is that goes up very steadily as kids get older. So if we were to see a change in, the need for food security over a year or 2 years, we have that path data to compare kind of the pre-VYKAT to. So I think that's probably one of the most, it's very challenging to measure hyperphagia directly, but I think if you were to see like a change in the environment and the kids still being healthy, that would be a real indication that there's some real impact in the home.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that too. What Teresa's saying is that, it just was fortuitous that the registry has existed for 10 years and that we did path before VYKAT, because we really have such strong natural history data of what PWS has looked like to date, and the ability then to compare it to what might PWS look like as a result of VYKAT or other interventions in the future. And I think that, what you were saying, Stacy, too, about the confidentiality, hopefully it's twofold. One is that, maybe there are experiences that families are hesitant to put into social media, but they are willing to put it into a secure database so that we're getting accurate information. And the second part is going back to this idea that being an IRB approved study, like it's a registered research study, which is a requirement for being able to publish data into the scientific literature, being able to, use it for regulatory agencies or insurance, any of those ways that the data is going to be used. Having it be within an IRB approved study like this allows that information to be used for those purposes.
That also, I think, we should mention that there's a governance board for the
Oh, yeah,
registry
for sure.
itself. So if you want to talk about that and how people can ask for surveys to be put in, and how that information is protected within our governance.
Yeah, actually, that was exactly what I was gonna
Oh.
say. So,
Great minds.
so I'm an investigator on the Global PWS Registry, but we have two physicians who are also the co-principal investigators, and that's Dr. Jennifer Miller and Dr. Sean McCandless. So they oversee all of the activities of the registry. In addition, we have a governing board that changes over time, but we have, two additional physicians, two parent representatives, two representatives from patient organizations, and then an industry representative, but it's an industry person who is not doing PWS work, so can give us some guidance. And that governing board oversees all of the studies that are put into the registry, and also all the data that comes out of the registry. And their charge is to make sure that the data is being used in the ways that the protocol says it's going to be used, and being used in ways that benefit the PWS community. So there's a lot of oversight to make sure that all of the data is being used in ways that benefit the community, and where the information is getting out, but individual data is being protected.
Well,
Stacy, you have insight. You can speak
Yeah.
to the board.
Because I can speak to this. So I would say, one of the things that I found particularly reassuring was how seriously people take that charge. Like it's not a governance board from the perspective of in name only. There's thoughtful questions and thoughtful discussion, and is this really the right thing? And it really, from my experience, being a part of that was really, one, empowering, but also like it's a sense of comfort to know that people's information is really being protected by these multiple layers and being used in the most ethical ways.
I was going to say, one of the things our governing board often does is, we get groups, sometimes academic, sometimes pharmaceutical, and they just basically say, well, I'd like all the data, I just want to look at it, and the governing board will come back and say, like, let's narrow it. What question are you asking? And then you can have the data that answers that question, but it has to be a thoughtful question, and then we can provide the data to answer that.
Yeah. How
Sorry.
long does the data stay in the registry? Is it
In
forever?
perpetuity. Yeah, no, it's in there forever. There is a way by which if a family opts to remove themselves, you can request to remove yourself. So the system itself is to be forever, but if you as an individual participant opt that it's no longer something that you want to now the difference, you can opt, okay, I'm just not going to engage anymore. Maybe I'm not going to contribute anything else, right? But there is also the option to completely remove your account if you were to so choose. Yeah. And there is also the process for the accounts to be transferred to another family member or caregiver. So, one of the things that we've been thinking a lot more about in recent years is aging in PWS from the perspective of surveys and data collection and trying to understand, okay, what are the major health issues that are facing young adults, seniors with PWS? Is it being a senior, or is aging different in PWS than it is in the typical population? But also, how do we make sure that if somebody's parents pass away and that they were the ones managing that account, there is a way to transfer that account to a sibling or to another legally authorized representative, so that that account can still continue to go on.
We've also had some instances where the person with PWS may have passed. And so parents can contact us directly and let us know that. Not only is that helpful and informative, but it will also ensure that the communication regarding requests to complete surveys and things like that stops.
Mhm. Let's talk aging for a second. So this is something that Lynn and I are very, very interested in and spend a lot of time talking about. What is currently in the registry in terms of aging surveys and collecting that data?
So there aren't any surveys specific to aging. It's not, there isn't a survey that says, aging in PWS.
Do you want
But
there to be?
well, so that's something that that's something that we've talked about is, what is sort of the best approach? Because a lot of the topics that, we've had a lot of conversations with clinicians who work with adults in PWS and with yourself and with Lynn and, sort of talking about what are the concerns. And a lot of those topics are already covered in other surveys within the registry. And so it's a matter of trying to figure out what is the best way. Is it to design a new survey, but then it could be duplicating stuff that's already there, right? So basically, within any one survey, so neurology, gastrointestinal, we did really expand the cardiovascular and pulmonary survey as we migrate to 2.0. So we were not really capturing a lot of information about cardiovascular disease, but those questions have all been added in. And so basically going in and just providing updates, the survey asks, have you ever had this list of issues? And if you say no, which many parents of, an infant may just say no, the survey's over and done with. But if you say yes, then it's going to ask you your follow-up questions about when did it start, maybe about severity, have you ever been hospitalized for these things? So, within the endocrinology survey, there's a whole section about diabetes, which we understand is, something that is a concern. There's within the, like I said, the pulmonary survey, there's more questions about cardiovascular health. And so that would be something that's applicable. Within the orthopedic survey, there's questions about osteoporosis, osteopenia, frequency of broken bones, things along those lines, which are things that we understand are happening as people are aging. So I think for right now, it's about going in and filling out those individual body system surveys. And then the goal is that's going to hopefully help us inform what are areas we may need to dive into deeper. I will say the other question we do get a lot about, and there are surveys about this as well, are about living situations for adults with PWS. Where are people living as they become adults or as their parents may pass away? And so there's a whole survey in there about living situations, daily activities, things that, physical activity, things along those lines. There was an infographic, it was a while ago, but we found that of the people who are living in group homes, for example, that the families who were living in a PWS specific group home were much more satisfied with their living situation than people who were living in a non-PWS group home. And again, that sort of seems a little bit intuitive, but to be able to actually say, hey, look, like this is direct from families. This is hard numbers direct from families of what people are finding is most suitable for their loved ones. So that's also informative information as well.
Well, and that's great from like a advocacy perspective when we're helping somebody find a placement and showing, the benefit when, there's many states that do not have PWS specific group homes and aren't willing to fund an out-of-state placement. So somebody could have one. That's really great supporting documentation. One of the things, Lynn, you and I are probably going to ask the same question. So why don't you go?
I don't know if we're going to ask the same question. We're about to find out. Stacy mentioned that we are very much into aging and being a parent, but also being a provider, providing residential services. I think this, just as I think, Jessica, you mentioned, there's a study going on where they're trying to capture early signs of OCD and psychosis. So how can we tackle some of these maybe dementia or loss of function type things as our folks age in a meaningful way, but also capturing, as we know, hopefully a lot of our individuals are in PWS specific homes when they get older. Now, I would think that some of the older parents might not be savvy or might not know about the registry, but we do as providers, right? We have a wealth of information about daily activities, and I would love to be able to fill out surveys on all of this stuff. You could capture a lot of stuff. So I understand that you can transfer like ownership of the survey, in a legal way, but I would love to kind of somehow be able to have residential providers be able to inform on these topics also, because we serve people from children all the way to their natural death. We're looking into their 70s that we're providing care, and hopefully we can really support not only the aging topics, but all the other health related topics. So it's good to know that can be transferred, but how do we can we move to a spot where folks that may never have been in the registry that are in a group home or residential setting, how can other caregivers start to help in this very important research process that will just inform best practices and how we provide care?
Sure.
Yeah.
I love it.
I think this is something we've talked about a number of times, and Lisa, you can weigh in too, because you did some of this with the PATH study. Step one is identifying for somebody who is in their 60s, 70s, who's living in a group home, is who is their legally authorized representative, because that is the person that would need to create the count and sign the consent, and then either complete the surveys themselves, or if they're not with that person every day. Maybe it's a sibling who, they live in a different state, but would be willing to provide that login information to the caregiver who is with that family member. So it's a little bit of a challenge, because it is dependent upon identifying who is the legally authorized representative for that individual. Is it themselves? Who is it? Lisa, do you want to weigh in a little bit on that, or?
Yeah, so during the PATH study, we did have a number of participants that lived in residential placements away from their legally authorized representative. And in those instances, we did utilize the help of the professional caregivers to complete surveys. And we had designed some of the surveys in a manner that they could complete it electronically on a fillable form, and then we entered in that information. But as Jessica mentioned, having the ability for a caregiver with permission of the legal guardian to complete those surveys, we could, have information entered into the system. And I do think you're exactly right, Lynn. It's a really critical piece of the PWS lived experience that we really need a better understanding of. I think we got a taste of what aging starts to look like through the PATH study. We had individuals in the study that were in their 40s, 50s, and 60s that were providing information, but to have a rich data set is really truly informative for our community.
How do we get the word out, do you think, to maybe providers or these families, I don't even, maybe the families aren't connected with either FPWR or PWSA, but how do we reach out and say, hey, there is an opportunity and this is how it can benefit the community and it's something worthwhile doing? It might take a few extra steps, but here's how you can help us.
Like,
How do we get that out?
This podcast perspective, we're going to have the link to join the registry in the show notes for the podcast for anybody who's listening. So they'll be able to find that there. But I think it's a bigger marketing and communications piece that we've got
And
to
I
be working together on.
Exactly. I think this is a great opportunity for FPWR and PWSA have collaborated on a number of things. And I think this could be because we've been doing this in kind of a one-off fashion, right? So if someone contacts us and says, my sibling who's 45, like, I'd like to get into the registry, we'll help them do that. But we haven't been aside from the PATH study, which was, is now over, we haven't been proactive about, okay, so here's the plan for reaching out to these residential homes and giving them instructions on, how to find the legally authorized and then do this and then do this. And then having, it's been a bit of a bandwidth issue, right? So we haven't had the personnel time to be following up and getting those things set up. So I think it is just a matter of committing to time and resources to do that. But I agree. What the PATH study showed us was that, not shockingly again, but definitely those older individuals are having more of the serious medical events that are sending them to the hospital. And having an understanding of that is a good starting place. As Jessica said, we've expanded some of the surveys, especially on the cardiovascular side and respiratory side, because those are the kinds of issues that we saw in those older individuals. So really then committing to expanding that data set and being able to plan next steps. And there are some online assessments of cognitive ability that you can follow over time and looking at that. So, we've talked about, we have the PATH study. What about the aging PATH study? So I think that's something that would be really good to try to develop over the next year or so.
Yeah. And we've had some early meetings. We have some people were in a working group trying to sort of assess what are some of these tools that are used, not necessarily in PWS, but in other populations to assess cognition in senior citizens, in aging and dementia. You mentioned dementia, Lynn, and Down syndrome. What are some of the assessments that are being used in other populations and which of those might be the best tool, kind of trying to analyze the pros and cons of each of those and determining which ones may be the best for us to pilot in PWS. So it's an ongoing conversation that once we finish migrating and translating, then will be the next major goal.
Well, count us in. We're willing to help with that. And, from a residential provider perspective, one of the things that I think we could do that will help with the bandwidth is we're hosting next August a standalone professional provider conference and would love to have somebody come and talk about the registry and start educating them. Some of the bigger providers, so like Latham Centers and Prader-Willi Homes and AME, they're going to know, or somebody on their team is going to know about the registry. But last year we had 30 different provider agencies attend.
Oh, wow. Yeah, great.
It's a great way to get a large group of them at once. That will be in Savannah, Georgia. So that's a way that, we could collaborate on that. And Lynn and I had a meeting earlier about some of the aging things that the providers are seeing, especially now that so many individuals are outliving their parents, which is a great problem to have. But for a lot of them, that leaves no one as the legal representative. I'm just thinking through all the ways that we'll have to figure out how to navigate that piece of the puzzle.
I mean, I think that's what's so great about the registry is, what providers are seeing, what physicians are seeing, can all be tailored into asking these questions. I mean, we have the one end of the spectrum with the aging. I'm really curious about how is VYKAT going to change the natural history of PWS? And, we're going to see some younger kids getting on VYKAT, and how is that going to look different? So having that longitudinal aspect is, I think, what's really great about the registry is we can start asking questions today and see 5 or 6 years, what difference is it making in the life of an individual with PWS?
Absolutely.
That's fascinating to me. That's just so amazing because with these new therapies coming out, maybe we won't. Maybe what you're going to see over time is the less and less need for residential services, or there's going to be other things popping up, or the supervision needed, or the behavioral challenges might shift, and we'll be able to show that in real time. It's because of these different therapeutics or whatever we're becoming informed because of these surveys and the education that we can produce from that. Yeah, it's just so exciting.
Well, ladies, thank you for being with us. Is there any last minute things or any plugs for the registry that you'd like to give out to the community? Encourage people. Yes, Lisa.
I would make one more remark, which is to say sometimes navigating that registry can feel overwhelming. And Jessica and myself are both administrators on that registry. We are here to help families. So if you get stuck, don't give up. Give us an email, give me a call. My phone is direct to me. We can publish that information to Stacy, so families can reach out to us directly for direct support on setting up the account if that's where you're getting stuck, or if you're getting stuck with which is the first survey I should do and what's most important. Don't get bogged down in the details. Let us help you so that you can start providing your information and make that meaningful contribution. We're here to help everyone. And I would also say one of the things that's a really important and helpful thing when you're setting up your account and you're selecting your preferences for how you want to be communicated with regarding clinical trials and filling out those surveys every 6 months. I promise we will not bombard you with emails. We don't like to get them either. We like to keep our inboxes at a minimum. But that being said, some of these surveys we do ask that you fill out every 6 months, and we don't expect you to remember that it's been 6 months. So making sure you check the preference to receive that communication from the registry. We will be very selective in what we send you, but it is a nice way for you to be reminded that there's an opportunity to provide an update to us.
And I'll add in on what Lisa said too, another function as a user. We know life happens. You're doing something at the computer and an emergency, somebody breaks something in the living room, you need to go. The surveys can all be saved as drafts. So like if you're in the middle of something, you can save it as a draft and come back to it later. And you can do one survey at a time. Sometimes, one of the beauties, it's comprehensive. We talked, there's like 40, 50, I don't even know what the number is currently
45,
anymore,
something like that.
45
Yeah.
surveys. You don't need to do them all the very, very first time you sit down. You can do one, you can save it halfway through, come back and do it later that night. You can do another one the next day. So you can come in as you have time.
That's so important to know. Full disclosure, I felt pressure when I was starting to enter. So I have to do all of these surveys. And then I'm like, oh, I don't have time for this. As we know, with parents or with loved ones with PWS, I don't have time to sit there and do 4 to 5. So that's great that you can pend it, you can save it. You don't have to do all of them all at
Nope.
once.
Do them.
Take
You
your
can
time.
Teresa's joked about having like a Friday night glass of wine with like having a mom's group, a Friday
Just one glass of
night
wine.
fill out the registry glass of wines group. Like a
I know.
standing
It's a
Zoom
twist on the
meeting for
book
anybody
club.
who wants to come in. Yeah.
One
I
of my
love that.
favorites is going to conference and people coming up to me going, "I'm so sorry, I haven't done my surveys." And I'm like,
Oh,
"Oh, no, no, no.
It's
Not
real. The pressure you feel. It's just,
No. Just do what you can when you can. I will say the other thing that now, of course, mine was one of the first records in there. I've got 10 years of data. And, if I want to think, oh, when was he on this medication? When did we start and stop that? It's all in there. So, it is for the community, but it actually can be a really good living record of your child over the years. So,
can you
there is
print that off?
Yeah, you can print all of your answers to a survey and just print it out. And so like you could
Oh, okay.
print it out and just take it with you someplace.
That's
Eh,
how many times have I been asked, when did your child start to sit, stand, crawl? I don't know. I don't remember, but this would be great. My brain. Yeah.
Yep. Just go in there, print out that developmental milestone survey, and you're good to go.
or the medication. When did he stop this or what? Yeah, that kind of thing is also in there. Yeah.
well, and I think, back to the bandwidth, I think it was you, Jessica, who said if the answer is no to the first question, you don't have to answer the next 30 questions on that survey. You move to the next because that survey is done. And I think that helps take a little bit of that pressure off too. There's 45 surveys in there, but not all of them may apply.
And to clarify, if you say no, like for example, we're talking about developmental milestones with Lynn, right? And that your child is 2 years old and hasn't done some things, you might say no right now, and then you can come back in and change your answer to yes later, and it will bring up those questions. Or if you're the caregiver of somebody who's in their 40s and you filled out the whole neurology survey and put all kinds of information in there about all different sorts of different things, but you click no to seizures, and then the person develops seizures, you can go in, change that one thing to yes, but all of your other stuff is still there and is still populated. Like it's a living medical record. You don't have to go in and answer all of these surveys over and over and over again, except for, as Theresa mentioned, some of the ones that are designed to be taken at a 6-month interval, like the hyperphagia questionnaire. But everything else, it will populate with your previous answers.
Again, not an IT person, but somebody was a genius because that's really helpful.
Thank you for listening to this episode of PWS United. If you want to learn more about Prader-Willi syndrome and how PWSA USA is making strides in advocacy, family support, and research, visit www.pwsausa.org. And while you're there, we encourage you to sign up for our Pulse email newsletter to stay informed about the latest news, resources, and events. Don't forget to subscribe to the PWS United podcast so you never miss an episode. Our team is always available to support families and their loved ones living with PWS 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You can call us at 941-312-0400 or email info@pwsausa.org. Catch a new episode next Tuesday, and until then, have a great week.